Y'all ready to rock and roll today? Sorry, I have a bit of a cough. Finally was able to get out my rabbit ears. It looks so good. The rabbit ears. Let's find a really cool, little fantasy type jacket to go with it. I have a steampunk jacket too that I'm thinking I'll probably also mesh with this at some point. So yeah, we are going to continue reading today. We are at the Collinses, and we are also going to do some channel updatey type stuff. Updates to the channel. Oh god. So I'm gonna keep streaming, but I'm not really sure where I am with school currently. So I don't know if I'm going to have to get another job or not. But I will keep streaming even if I do have to get a job, and it's going to be a while because I have to go back to the Department of Rehabilitation, which is just a whole lot of bureaucracy that nobody ever wants to deal with. So that is what we are going to end up doing. I love the way my ears look when I to read. So yeah, I'm probably going to have to go back to the DOR. I might end up doing some more secretarial training. That's kind of where I'm at right now. Just because not really sure where I am with school or kind of what I'm doing on that end. So that's really long term in the future. Yeah. I suppose we should kind of probably get to Pride and Prejudice. I mean, there is the OnlyFans stuff is coming, and I'm gonna try to get more stuff up on my Etsy page. In regards to the OnlyFans stuff, it's been kind of difficult because I don't live alone. So, taking pictures where I am in, interesting positions with, very little on is kind of difficult when you don't live alone. So, yeah, that's kind of been one of the problems there. And then also, just finding backdrops has been my main thing. I've been trying to scope out a lot of backdrops and stuff as well. Yeah, so those are coming. It's just difficult when you don't live alone because I don't want my mom to walk in on me butt-ass naked because that's an awkward conversation for everyone. Of course, I wouldn't be butt-ass naked, but it's still an awkward conversation for everyone. I would be wearing something. Not a lot of something, but something. Yeah, I just don't want that awkward conversation. I also might go back to streaming Guild Wars 2 a bit as well when the patch kind of goes down and we go back to Throwback Thursday. I did really make a really pretty character in Guild Wars 2 that I kind of want to show everyone because I'm very proud of this character design. However, it's not Guild Wars 2 is a little bit complicated to stream, so we'll see. I did have some issues last time streaming Guild Wars 2. I'm kind of hopeful that it won't happen this time because I have a little bit more of a support system, but we'll see. I think it'll be fun though. Yeah, so currently we are on, yes. We are about to meet Mr. Colins. Now remember, the Bennets are sort of what would be considered middle class in this day and age, so it's a little bit different for them in proceeding, but because there are no sons in this day and age, women were not considered citizens in this time period. The Bennet family house, when Mr. Bennet dies, will pass to the next male relative in his family. So that is not going to be any of the Bennet sisters. This is going to be the next male relative. So just, there's a little bit of there's a lot of tension there, but you'll see. I hope, my dear, said Mr. Bennet to his wife, as they were at breakfast the next morning, that you have ordered a good dinner today, because I have reason to suspect an addition to our party. Who do you mean, my dear? I know nobody that would be coming, I am sure, unless Charlotte Lucas should happen to call in, and I hope my dinners are good enough for her. I do not believe she often sees such at home. The person of whom I speak is a gentleman and a stranger. Mrs. Bennet's eyes sparkled. A gentleman and a stranger. It is Mr. Bingley, I am sure. Why, Jane, you never dropped a word of this, you sly thing. Well, I am sure I'll be extremely glad to see Mr. Bingley, but, good Lord, how unlucky. There's not a bit of fish to be got today. Lydia, my love, ring the bell. I must speak to Hill this moment. It is not Mr. Bingley, said her husband. It is a person of whom I have never saw in the course of my whole life. This roused a general astonishment, and he had the pleasure of being eagerly questioned by his wife and 5 daughters at once. After amusing himself some time with their curiosity, he thus explained, About a month ago I received this letter. About a fortnight ago I answered it, for I thought it a case of some delicacy and requiring early attention. It is from my cousin, Mr. Colins, who, when I am dead, may turn you all out of this house as soon as he pleases. Oh, my dear, cried his wife, I cannot bear to hear that mentioned. Pray do not talk of that odious man. I do think it is the hardest thing in the world that your estate should be entailed away from your own children. I am sure if I had been you, I should have tried long ago to do something or other about it. Jane and Elizabeth attempted to explain to her the nature of an entail. They had often attempted it before, but it was a subject on which Mrs. Bennet was beyond reach of reason. She continued to rail bitterly against the cruelty of setting an estate away from her family of 5 daughters, in favor of a man who nobody cared anything about. It is certainly a most iniquitous affair, said Mr. Bennet, and nothing can clear Mr. Colins from the guilt of inheriting Longbourn. But if you will listen to the letter, you may perhaps be a little softened by his manner of expressing himself. So here we can see Mrs. Bennet engaging in classical denial. Like I said, denial is something Mrs. Bennet does engage in a lot. And like most things, denial starts as a coping mechanism. You know, your body does a lot of denial naturally. Like when you see something shocking or when you're in a situation, you will deny the situation to cope with the situation. And there are times when that can be very beneficial. However, like most things that become an issue, it starts as a coping mechanism and then it kind of turns into something that becomes more of a crutch and less of a coping mechanism. And then you have to work on getting it back into being just a coping mechanism that you can pull out of your toolbox when you need it, but not something you're relying on 24/7. And a lot of people can't tell, and I'm included in this too. Sometimes I can't tell when I'm using something as a coping mechanism or when it's become so much of something that I've been using that it's because of something that I've relied on rather than something that is in a bag of tricks. Hello, Inuash and Nero. Hello, Chain-Smoking Moira. How are you doing today? How is life going? Y'all ready for Mr. Colins? Yeah, so we see Mrs. Bennet engaging in denial. Mr. Colins is the next male relative, so he is going to inherit their estate, despite the fact that there are still people living in it. Mrs. Bennet does not have the funds to supply for her daughters if Mr. Bennet were to die and they were to be kicked out. I'm okay. And okay is wonderful. Like, you know, maybe not 100% today, but not lower than 100%. I at least have some aspect of where things are going. Sometimes life is aimless and you just gotta walk it. Okay, it's wonderful. No, I am sure I shall not. I think it was very impertinent of him to write you at all, and very hypocritical. I hate such false friends. Why could not he keep on quarreling with you as his father did before him? Why, indeed, he does seem to have some filial scruples on that head, as you will hear. Alright, so this is a letter from Mr. Colins to Mr. Bennet. Now, Mr. Colins has never met Mr. Bennet. So Mr. Bennet and his brother did not get along. They had a very long, rowdy quarrel in which they just kind of stopped talking to each other and hated each other. Mr. Colins is Mr. Bennet's brother's son. Mr. Colins has never met his uncle or any of his cousins. And he is next in line to inherit the estate because he's the next male relative. So he is trying to make things peaceful. And you'll see in this letter, he's trying to basically be like, hey, I know we're all in a crappy situation because you have 5 daughters and it's a problem. I'm trying to, like, not make this a problem, is basically what he's kind of saying. So he wrote Mr. Bennet a letter. Hunsford near Westminster, Kent, 15th of October. Dear Sir, the disagreement subsisting between yourself and my late honored father has always given me such uneasiness, and since I have the misfortune to lose him, I have frequently wished to heal the breach, but for some time I was kept back by my own doubts, fearing lest it might seem disrespectful to his memory for me to be on good terms with anyone whom it had always pleased him to be at variance. There, Miss Bennet, my mind, however, is now made up on the subject. For having received ordination at Easter, I have been so fortunate as to be distinguished by the patronage of the Right Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourgh, widow of Sir Louis de Bourgh, whose bounty and benefits has preferred me to the valuable rectory of this parish, where it shall be my earnest endeavour to demean myself with great respect towards her ladyship, and to be ever ready to perform those rites and ceremonies which are instituted by the Church of England. As a clergyman, moreover, I feel it is my duty to promote and establish the blessing of peace in all families within the reach of my influence, and on the grounds that I flatter myself that present overtures of good being in the next entail of Longbourn State will be kindly overlooked on your side, and not lead you to reject the offered olive branch. I cannot be otherwise concerned at being the means of injuring your amiable daughters, and beg leave to apologize for it, as well as assure you my readiness to make every possible amends. But if this hereafter I should have no objection to receive me to your house, I propose myself the satisfaction of waiting on you and your family Monday, November 18th by 4 o'clock, and shall probably trespass on your hospitality till the Saturday night following. A wish that I can do without any inconvenience, as Lady Catherine is far from objecting to my occasional absence on a Sunday, provided that some other clergyman is engaged to the duties of the day. I remain, dear sir, with respectful compliments to your lady and your daughters, your well-wisher and friends, Mr. William Collins. Hello, Ghost Tiger! How are you? So, okay, couple things to remember. Number one, Mr. Collins is like in his 20s. He's not in his 30s. He's not even close to his 30s. He's like at most 25. He's like at most 25, okay? But he's gonna talk like he's in his 30s. He's gonna talk like he's 30 or 40 years old. We're still in Pride and Prejudice. We're picking up where we left off, Mark Rides. We're meeting Mr. Collins. Anyway, so Mr. Collins is gonna talk like he's 34 years old, but remember, he's not. He's like my age. Mr. Collins is like 23. He's like my age, but he puts on these airs of being like better than he is. Mr. Collins kind of lives in his own world, but you can see. So Mr. Collins has his own church, and the other thing that he does here is he very strategically invites himself over to the Bennett's house, basically being like, this is going to be my house. I want to come meet you and see the place I am going to live. But, you know, he very strategically kind of invites himself over to their house and basically says how long he will be staying at their house. He's like, oh yeah, I'm coming over to your house, and this is how long I'll be staying. But he's very, like, pompous about it. Pompous is a very good way to describe Mr. Collins here. How are you doing today, Mark Rides? How are you doing? I hope your life is doing well. Or at least okay. Okay is okay. Yeah, so he very subtly and strategically invites himself to stay at their house that will become his house. It's not very I guess it's not super subtle, but it's very much like, yeah, I'm just gonna come stay at this, you know, which is little oblivious. I think also oblivious and pompous are great ways to describe Mr. Collins. He's a little oblivious to the world around him, and he's a little pompous about the world around him, and he thinks very highly of himself because of his patron. Oh, it's good that you're doing good, Mark Rides. That's good. I'm glad you're doing well. I'm always happy to hear that people are doing okay. I'm also okay to hear that people are not doing okay. We can all deal. So Mr. Bennet, he's Mr. Bennet's next male relatives. So when Mr. Bennet dies, it will be his house. Yeah. So the way it worked in this time, presumptuous is also a good one, yeah. The way it worked in this time was that the next male relative would receive the house. So because Mr. Bennet has 5 daughters, The next male relative would be his nephew, which is Mr. Colins. Mr. Colins has a patronage named Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Now, this was something that would happen where, like, if the nobles would basically, like, you know, it's kind of like the nobles would support a person in town. So, Mr. Colins is the preacher, or, you know, the priest in town, in Lady Catherine de Bourgh's town. Now, Lady Catherine de Bourgh is a rarity in this time period because she is a widow of a very, very rich man, a very rich noble, and she has maintained her status despite him dying, which, you know, is not always heard of in this day and age. So that's very notable. That's very interesting in of itself. But also just that, like, yeah. I'm not super up to date on law in this, like, Regency kind of era of time. It may be possible. Maybe. But, there is no son-in-law at this point in time. So at this point in time in the book, there is no son-in-law for it to be bequeathed to. So Mr. Colins is of, yeah. So I am not up to date on Regency era, housing law. So there is a possibility because, yeah, also, like, law at this time was also just very, like, but, yeah, so, okay. At 4 o'clock, therefore, we may expect this peacemaking gentleman, said Mr. Bennet, as he folded up the letter. He seems to be the most conscientious and polite young man. Upon my word, I doubt he will not prove a valuable acquaintance, especially if Lady Catherine should be so indulgent as to let him come to us again. There is some sense in what he is saying about the girls. However, if he is disposed to make them any amends, I shall not be the person to discourage him. Though it is difficult, said Jane, to guess in what way he can mean to make us the atonement he thinks our due, the wish is certainly to his credit. Elizabeth was chiefly struck with this an extraordinary deference for Lady Catherine, and this kind of intention of christening, marrying, and burying his parishioners wherever it were required. He must be an oddity, I think, said she. I cannot make him out. There is something very pompous in his style. And what can he mean by apologizing for being next in the entail? We cannot suppose he would help it if he could. Can he be a sensible man, sir? No, my dear, I think not. I have great hopes of finding him quite the reverse. There is a mixture of servility and self-importance in his letter, which promises well. I am impatient to see him. In point of comparison, said Mary, this letter does not seem defective. The idea of an olive branch perhaps is not wholly new, yet I think it is rather well expressed. To Catherine and Lydia, neither the letter nor its writer were in any degree interesting. It was next to impossible that their cousin should come in a scarlet coat, and it was now some weeks since they had received pleasure from the society of a man in any other color. As for their mother, Mr. Colins' letter had done away much of her ill will, and she was preparing to see him with a degree of composure which astonished her husband and her daughters. So Mr. Bennet is hoping that he can basically bend Mr. Colins to his will. Mr. Bennet is saying, oh no, Mr. Colins is not serious. Like, Mr. Colins is not a studious guy. Like, I'm hoping that this guy is someone I can kind of, like, bend and kind of, like, mess with a bit. That's what Mr. Bennet's hoping. He can kind of manipulate Mr. Colins into doing what he kind of thinks should happen with the estate. That's kind of where Mr. Bennet's head is at. He's like, this guy seems interesting and also, like, kind of a fool that I can just kind of, like, wrap around my little finger and maybe put in my back pocket or whatever, you know? That's kind of where Mr. Bennet's headspace is at here. Basically, when Lizzie's asking, will he be a sensible man, she's wondering if he will try to let them stay at Longbourn or if he will kick them out when Mr. Bennet dies. But Mr. Bennet is thinking, like, oh, when you say sensible, you mean something other than when I mean sensible. Mr. Bennet's like, oh, no, he's not a sensible man, which is good for us. He's saying, like, if he was sensible, he would kick us out and just take the house. But since he's not sensible, we can kind of, like, mess with him so that, like, maybe, like, when Mr. Bennet does die, like, Mr. Colins won't just immediately kick them out. Mr. Colins was punctual to his time, and he was received with great politeness by the whole family. Mr. Bennet indeed said little, but the ladies were ready enough to talk, and Mr. Colins seemed neither in need of encouragement nor inclined to be silent himself. He was tall, heavy-looking young man of 25, so he's 25. Mr. Collins is 25, and pay attention to the way he talks, because part of the very interesting way Jane Austen writes is she writes Mr. Collins as a much older character. But it's just to kind of point out how people in society, to try to make themselves seem like a higher status than they were, would talk like they were older than they were or a little bit of more importance than they were. So a lot of people, when they read the book, they don't think Mr. Collins of this 25-year-old young guy. They think of him as a much older guy because that's just the way he talks. But it's a very satirical take on like how people put up airs and how people present themselves to the world. And, like, I know that I present myself in different ways to the world, too. Like, when I first meet people, I'll sometimes present myself as younger than I am, or I'll act a little bit younger than I am, because I'm worried about how other people will react to me. So I think if I'm younger than I am, maybe they'll be a little bit kinder to me than if I acted like a 23-year-old. A lot of times people say they think I'm shy, and they think I'm maybe a little bit naive until I open my mouth, which is fair. But yeah, like, I know that, like, yeah, the way you present yourself to the world matters. Sometimes I also come on really strong if I want to put up, like, a big front at first, like, just charge in. But, like, yeah, a lot of times when I'm in a situation where I am uncomfortable, I present myself as much younger than I am. One, because I always look younger than I am. And two, because I'm hoping people will be kinder to me as a result and maybe not be as harsh on me. That's, like, it's like a fear mechanism. And also because I'm, like, used to being treated younger than I am, so there's that. But, you know. So Mr. Collins is trying to make himself sound older and more important than he is to try to bolster himself up, or because he thinks he's kind of higher because of his patronage and stuff like that. But he's kind of in the same position as the Bennets. His air was grave and stately, his manners were formal. He had not been long seated before he complimented Mrs. Bennet on having a fine family of daughters, and he had heard much of their beauty, but that in this intense fame had fallen short of the truth, and added that he did not doubt her seeing them all in due time well disposed of in marriage. This gallantry was not much to the taste of some of his hearers, but Mrs. Bennet, who quarrelled with no compliments, answered most readily. You are kind, I am sure. I wish with all my heart that it may prove so, for else they will be destitute enough. Things are settled so oddly. You allude, perhaps, to the entail of the estate. Ah, sir, I do indeed. It is a grievous affair to my poor girls, you must confess. Not that I mean to find fault with you, for such things I know are all chance in this world. There is no knowing how estates will go when they come to be entailed. I am as very sensible, madam, of the hardship to my fair cousins, and could say much on the subject, but I am cautious of appearing forward and precipitate. But I can assure the young ladies that I come prepared to admire them and at present I will not say more, but perhaps when we are better acquainted. He was interrupted by a summons to dinner, and the girls smiled on each other. They were not the only subjects of Mr. Collins's admiration. The hall, the dining room, and its furniture were examined and praised, and his commendation of everything would have touched Mrs. Bennet's heart, but for the mortifying suspicion of his viewing it all as his own future property. The dinner, too, in turn, was highly admired, and he begged to know which of his fair cousins the excellency of the cooking was owing. But here he was set right by Mrs. Bennet, who assured him with some asperity that they were very well able to keep a good cook, and that her daughters had nothing to do in the kitchen. He begged pardon for having displeased her. In a softened tone, she declared herself not at all offended, but he continued to apologize for a quarter of an hour. Okay. So, Mrs. Bennet kind of poking at Mr. Collins here, being like, I know you're going to inherit the estate. So if you want to, like, everything that you're saying, like, he's basically walking around this house and being like, oh, your house is so nice, so lovely. You know, like, what you do when you're a guest in a home. You're like, your house is very nice, it's lovely. But because he's going to inherit the house in the future, it kind of comes across as him being like, oh, I can't wait to get this. Like, this is cool. That's going to be mine. Like, I can't believe this is going to be mine someday. And the thing about having, like, a cook in the kitchen, so at this point in time, you had, like, you know, a class system. It was like a very rigid class system. I would say we still kind of have a class system today, it's just not as rigid as it was in this era. So in this era you had a very rigid class system, so being able to keep a cook is a sign of the Bennets being middle class. And Mr. Collins suggesting that the daughters had to cook could be seen as an insult in this time. So that's, yeah. And you can see that Mr. Collins kind of over apologizes. He's trying to he's overdoing it. He wants to be very certain. Usually if someone's overdoing something, they're either very insecure personally, or they really want something to happen, or they really want an outcome and they are mortified of that outcome not happening. It could be a little bit of both too. It could be that Mr. Collins is very insecure in how other people view him, and he's mortified that the outcome he wants is not going to happen. These are just things that people do. So yeah, usually when someone over apologizes for that. It can also come from fear and trauma too. I know when I was a kid, if I dropped a plate or if I did something wrong, I would freak the fuck out because I was so worried about being yelled at or being hurt or having something bad happen to me that I would 150% over apologize and freak out and just be like, don't get mad at me, don't get mad at me, don't get mad at me. Yeah, Bear's barking. He's got that German Shepherd bark. He's, we actually managed to see some of his, we did, on the DNA test, it links us to some of his relatives, and his dad must have been the German Shepherd Doberman mix, because he has a lot of relatives that are very German Shepherdy, and he only has a couple relatives that are very pit bully. So his dad must have been the German Shepherd, Doberman mutt mix, and his dad's jumping fences somewhere out there in rural California, because there's a lot of puppies. Yeah, there's a lot. He does have one sibling. He does have a couple siblings that are very pit bully. So, his mom's also, had some puppies. But, most of his siblings are very, German Shepherd Doberman-y. But he definitely has that German Shepherd bark. Where you know not to enter the house because of that bark. And he does the Doberman patrolling thing, too. Where he kind of puts his head level and he patrols around. That's a very, Doberman-y type thing to do. The patrolling of the area. But he's not possessive, which is good. But yeah. Dobermans do this very level-headed patrolling type thing. But he's also, I think he's got more Great Dane in him than they think, because his legs just keep going. But yeah. Yes, he is patrolling our house and barking at the neighbors for doing construction. One of my neighbors owns a construction business and will occasionally do construction-y type things, which I don't really think he needs to do. I think it's more just he owns a construction business and he's semi-retired and he's looking for something to do. My grandfather does the same thing. My grandfather is a retired lawyer, and he's constantly looking for new, law-y type loophole-y things to exploit. I'm just bored. During the dinner, Mr. Bennet scarcely spoke at all, but when the servants were withdrawn, he thought it time to have some conversation with his guest, and therefore started a subject in which he expected him to shine, by observing that he seemed very fortunate in his patronage. Lady Catherine de Bourgh's attention to his wishes and consideration for his comfort appeared very remarkable. Mr. Bennet could not have chosen better. Mr. Colins was eloquent in her praise. The subject elevated him to more than usual solemnity of manner, and with a most important aspect he protested that he had never in his life witnessed such behavior in a person of rank, such affability and condescension as he had himself experienced from Lady Catherine. She had been graciously pleased to approve of both the discourses which he had already had the honor of preaching before her. She had also asked him twice to dine at Rosings, and sent for him only the Saturday before to make up her pool of quadrille in the evening. Lady Catherine was reckoned proud by many people he knew, but he had never seen anything but affability in her. She had always spoken to him as she would any other gentleman. She had made not the smallest objection to his joining in the society of the neighborhood, nor to his leaving his parish occasionally for a week or two to visit his relations. She had even consented to advise him to marry as soon as he could, provided he chose with discretion, and had once paid him a visit in his humble parsonage, where she had perfectly approved of all the alterations he had been making, and had even vouched to suggest some herself, some shelves in the closets upstairs. "That is very all proper and civil, I am sure," said Miss Bennet, "and I dare say she is a very agreeable woman. It is a pity that great ladies in general are not more like her. Does she live near you, sir? The garden in which stands my humble abode is separated only by a lane from Rosings Park, her ladyship's residence." "I think she was a widow, sir. Has she any family?" "She has only one daughter, the heiress of Rosings, and very extensive property." "Ah!" cried Mrs. Bennet, shaking her head, "then she is better off than many girls. And what sort of young lady is she? Is she handsome?" "She is a most charming young lady indeed. Lady Catherine herself says that in point of true beauty Miss de Bourgh is far superior to the handsomest of her sex, because there is in her features which marks a young woman of distinguished birth. She is unfortunately of a sickly constitution, which has prevented her from making progress in many accomplishments which she could not otherwise have failed of, as I am informed by the lady who superintended her education and who still resides with them. But she is perfectly amiable and often condescends to drive my humble abode in her little phantom and ponies." So Mr. Collins is kind of describing Lady Catherine and how she functions. So Rosings is Lady Catherine's estate, so we know that Mr. Collins lives close to Lady Catherine's estate, and that Lady Catherine invites him to her gatherings. Now, Mr. Collins is not describing a lot of what Lady Catherine actually says. He's describing more of what she does, and it's very glossed over detail. Yeah, Lady Catherine is noble. So Lady Catherine was married to a lord, and that lord died, and Lady Catherine is a very wealthy widow who is a patron of Mr. Collins. So she has an estate named Rosings. Now, Lady Catherine and her husband had one daughter named Anne. Anne is very sickly, possibly of a genetic nature. It's kind of hinted that when they say markings of distinguished birth, so again, at this point in time, nobles basically interbred. Like, people were marrying their cousins, you know, there was a lot of just, you know, everybody goes in a circle type shit. You know, when your genetics make a circle instead of a tree. So it kind of hinted that Anne, Lady Catherine's daughter, has a genetic condition and that she isn't really present a lot. But because she is noble, she is still treated better than somebody, you know, like, she's still treated like a noble lady, but it's kind of hinted that maybe Anne is a bit of a sore spot for Lady Catherine, and maybe Lady Catherine overcompensates. Yeah. But, it's kind of into that, like, Anne maybe has some genetic issues from, yeah, there was a lot of incest. Like, I mean, not like incest, but yeah, like, you know, kind of keep all the best genes in the family, Alabama style. Not to diss Alabama, but like, come on, Alabama, get your shit together. But, like, yeah, there was a lot of, like, intermingling because the nobles believed that their blood was purer than the common folk, and so they kind of wanted to keep noble blood in supply, or, like, you know, that sort of stuff. So yeah, there was a lot of genetic issues, and, a really good example of this is the Habsburgs, which were not really England, they were more like Europe, Austria-Hungary, but the Habsburgs, they had some of the most incest because they had a slogan that was, solving conflict through marriage rather than war. The problem is, when you solve conflict through marriage rather than war, you end up marrying a lot of people who are related to you. And so, yes, like pug breeding, exactly. Humans actually developed very similar genetic deformities to like boxers and bulldogs. So the Habsburgs had the Habsburg chin, which would jut your bottom jaw out to the side. And they also had a lot of other like stuff. So there was like club feet were very common. So yeah, there was a lot of like genetic issues that existed during this time. Not to mention, like, you also have to take into consideration that we knew fucking nothing about medicine during this time. I think the humors was maybe still kind of like a thing. So, like, there was no... Medicine was basically, like... like, even if there was... Like, even if you weren't born with a genetic issue, there was very possibly you were fucked up by your doctors. Because, you know, bloodletting, all that other type of stuff where they would, like, bleed you. Yeah. So, I would look up, there's a really good channel, I think it's called, like, Live History or Painting Historical Faces, but this guy, he takes his, like, software that turns paintings into, like, kind of like real people, and he kind of talks about the history of the family and the conditions that a lot of them were born with, and their family tree, and stuff like that. It also happened in ancient Egypt too, and like this type of like incest circle jerk type situation, just like, yeah. So Anne has hinted that she probably has some genetic thing from a, you know, just like, I mean, it's not like sister and brother, but it is like cousin and cousin. Bloodletting is where they would, so they would actually, what they would do, let me just, reassess myself here. I used to have to get blood tests all the time, so I'm actually pretty good at this. They would cut your arm right here on your vein and bleed you. And they believed that letting off blood would help you. So if you were sick or injured, they would cut you and they would bleed you. Now, they also use leeches. Now, here's the thing about leeches. Leeches can actually, leeches are still used in modern medicine. However, it's a little different now. So sometimes leeches will be used to suck out an infection or something else, but it's used in moderation, and they've done a lot more research on it. So bloodletting, though, no basis in medicine. So bloodletting was a very common practice for ages. A really good podcast, if you're interested in the weird ways we've tried to fix people throughout history, is Sawbones, where a doctor and her husband basically recount the bizarre medical ways we've tried to fix people throughout history. That's a very good one to listen to. They have an episode on bloodletting. They also have an episode on leeches too, I'm pretty sure. So those are good ones. You learn a lot, and it's funny, very funny. You can kind of get them for free, so if you just Google them. So yeah, but yeah, so Sawbones is very good for that. Yeah, so the other thing is, like, even if you weren't, like, not during this time, this happened much later, but even after the Civil War, we still didn't know jack shit about medicine. Oh yeah, I'll post a link in chat. Are you on my Discord? I can also link it to my Discord channel. But yeah, I'll just post a link in chat real quick, to Sawbones. If you're interested in that type of stuff, yeah, I'll get a link going real quick. Yeah, Sawbones, A Marital Tour of Misguided Medicine. It's, you can listen to them for free on this site here. But yeah, it's a wife who's a doctor and her husband who's a comedian. They talk about the weird ways we've tried to fix people throughout time and history. And if that is something you are into, I suggest checking it out. Sawbones is the name of, what they would call surgeons in the Civil War who cut off people's arms and legs. But we didn't know jack shit. Even after the Civil War, we didn't know jack shit. And you wanna know why? Because Andrew Garfield, no, this was actually way after the Civil War. But anyway, Andrew Garfield was a president who no one remembers. And he was murdered by a crazy guy who was kicked out of a utopian sex colony because no one wanted to have sex with him, so that just lets you know the level of crazy this guy was at, Charles Gateau, or whatever his name was, and, he shot Andrew Garfield, but he didn't kill him, and on the stand, he claimed, oh, I just shot the guy. The doctors killed him because Andrew Garfield ended up getting an infection because the doctors took their unwashed hands and shoved them up him to try to get the bullet out. So, like, we didn't know jack shit, okay? Like, nothing. So the assassin basically claimed, I didn't kill the president, his doctors killed him, I just shot him. It didn't work, you know, typically, but it was an interesting point. But this is way after this book takes place. But you can just see that, like, we know nothing. Like, a lot of the times, like, we knew nothing. So, like, it's very, like, yeah. As she been presented, I do not remember her names among the ladies at court. Her indifferent state of health unhappily prevents her from being in town, and by that means, as I told Lady Catherine myself one day, has deprived the British court of its brightest ornament. Her ladyship seemed pleased with this idea, and as you may imagine, that I am happy on every occasion to offer those little delicate compliments which are always acceptable to the ladies. I have more than once observed to Lady Catherine that her charming daughter seemed to be born to be a duchess, and that the most elevated rank, instead of giving her consequence, would be adorned by her. These are the kind of little things which please her ladyship, and that sort of attention which I conceive myself particularly bound to pay. You judge very properly, said Mr. Bennet, and it is happy for you that you possess the talent of flattering with delicacy. May I ask whether these pleasing attentions proceed from the impulse of the moment, or are the result of previous study? They arise chiefly from what is passing at the time, and though I myself sometimes amuse myself with suggesting and arranging such elegant compliments as may be adapted to ordinary occasions, I can always wish to give them as unstudied an air as possible. Mr. Bennet's expectations were fully answered. His cousin was as absurd as he hoped, and he listened to them with the keenest enjoyment, maintaining at the same time the most resolute composure of countenance, and except in the occasional glance at Elizabeth, requiring no partner in his pleasure. Okay, so Mr. Colins is proving himself to be... So you can see that Mr. Bennet's suspicions were correct. He can wrap Mr. Colins around his finger because Lady Catherine's already wrapped him around her finger. Lady Catherine already has Mr. Colins basically feeding her everything she wants to hear. So Mr. Bennet is very hopeful that he can also get Mr. Colins to kind of do whatever he wants to. Because Mr. Colins has already proven himself to be very pliable by nature. You can also see that Mr. Colins is maybe a little bit of a quote-unquote nice guy, because he's like, oh, I arrange little compliments for the ladies. I always make sure to flatter them. I always make sure to do everything. But the person he's not flattering, he's talking about Anne de Bourgh, but he's talking to her mother, not Anne herself. So he's not really like, it's kind of like, it's weird, right? Like, that's a little weird, you know? And you can see that Mr. Bennet's just having fun observing the absurdity of Mr. Colins and, like, basically silent laughing with Elizabeth about it. Like, oh, this guy is delusional as fuck. Like, he lives in his own world and, you know, whatever. But, like, you can also, like, Mr. Colins kind of strikes me as... I don't want to say incel, because I don't think he's an incel. I think he's very much like a quote-unquote nice guy of this day and age. He thinks that because he is nice, and because he develops these compliments, and because he has patroness, that he's kind of entitled to stuff, per se. Or, like, entitled to the rank he desires. And I also don't think he's very grounded in reality. But again, just an opinion. Everybody's welcome to their own opinion. But he is kind of like, this is kind of like this century's version of a quote-unquote nice guy. Where he's like, oh, I arrange all these very lovely little compliments to the ladies and all of this. And I spend time thinking about it and whatever to try to, like, and it's just strange. And it's also strange to admit that in public a little bit. Not that I'm against that. You know, I'm a very blunt, honest person. But at the same time, in this day day and age, you don't say personal information in public. That's kind of the deal. And Mr. Colins, while he is family and a guest, this is the first time he's meeting any of them. So he's just a little weird. Food for thought. So, Mrs. Bennet also, this is also very interesting. So Mrs. Bennet saying, oh, has Anne been presented? So presenting would mean like, the whole debutante thing. Like, oh, my daughter's ready to be married. Feel free to come court her, gentlemen. It's basically saying, hey, I'm presenting my daughter at court in front of all these royals. She's ready to be married. If any of you are in the market for marriage, come court her, basically. But Mrs. Bennet, while she's saying this, basically says, yeah, I mean, okay, I'm a feminine person on the internet. I deal with a lot of nice guys. I was in the resource system. I had a big rant about nice guys in my last stream. I shouldn't go back there. But, I was in the resource system for a while where I was the only femme person there. I was in a room full of guys. Nothing wrong with that. It's made it very impossible for me to relate to girls, but nothing wrong with that. Like, nothing wrong with being in a room full of guys, it was fine, but, like, I'm used to dealing with that because I dealt with a lot of it, and, like, so, like, I'm, maybe, I might be projecting onto Mr. Colins a little bit with things that I've experienced, and again, it's, like, everybody's opinion, but, yeah, nice guys are usually guys that seem good, and then they're kind of like, oh, I can treat you better than any of these other men, or like, you're perfect, you're the best, or like, nobody's gonna love you the way I love you, or something like that, and it's very like, they're like, oh, I totally support women, no one will love you the way I love you, and it's like, I don't want other people to see you as an object, and it's a very hypocritical way of thinking, because they are seeing you as an object, and they are seeing you as less than, by not treating you as a person, by treating you as a thing. Yeah. Oh no, I got what you were saying. I have symbol imaging issues, so my brain usually just corrects to the first word I think of, and that was the first word I was thinking of. Half the words in this book, I think some of the words in this book I'm not pronouncing correctly, I'm just doing it confidently enough that nobody notices. That's the key. If you do it confidently enough, nobody's gonna question you. When you don't know, bullshit your way to the top. Yeah, so Mrs. Bennet's also saying she didn't see her names at court, which means Mrs. Bennet is paying attention to who's being presented at court and who she needs to look out for and all the royals and nobles, which kind of supports this theory that Mrs. Bennet is obsessed with money and status. It just supports the theory a little bit. A little bit. But Mr. Colins is basically saying that Anne de Bourgh's state of health doesn't allow her to be in London because London is very smoggy and doesn't allow her to be in the city because the city is very smoggy and dirty, and maybe hinting that maybe Anne has some sort of autoimmune disorder or something like that. Although at this time they wouldn't really know it as that because they didn't know the immune system existed. But maybe something that, is very sensitive to change in environment. Yeah. By tea time, however, the dose had been enough, and Mr. Bennet was glad to take his guest to the drawing room again, and when tea was over, glad to invite him to read aloud to the ladies. Mr. Colins readily assented, and a book was produced, but on beholding it, for everything announced it to be from a circulating library, he stared at the book and begging pardon, protesting that he never read novels. Kitty stared at him, and Lydia exclaimed, Other books were produced, and after some deliberation, he chose Forsyth's Sermons. Lydia gasped as he opened the volume, and before he had, with a very monotonous solemnity, read 3 pages, she interrupted him with, "Do you know, Mamma, that my Uncle Phillips talks of turning away Richard, and if he does, Colonel Forrester will hire him. My aunt told me so herself on Saturday. I shall walk to Meryton tomorrow to hear more about it, and to ask when Mr. Denny comes back from town." Lydia was bid by her 2 eldest sisters to hold her tongue, but Mr. Colins, much offended, laid aside his book and said, "I have often observed how little young ladies are interested by books of a serious stamp, though written solely for their benefit. It amazes me, I confess, for certainly there can be nothing so advantageous to them as instruction, but I will no longer importune my young cousin." Then, turning to Mr. Bennet, he offered himself as an antagonist at backgammon. Mr. Bennet accepted the challenge, observing that he acted very wisely in leaving the girls to their own trifling manners. Mrs. Bennet and her daughters apologized most civilly for Lydia's interruption, and promised that it would not occur again if he would resume his book, but Mr. Colins, after assuring him that he bore his cousin no ill will, and should never resent her behavior as any affront, seated himself at another table with Mr. Bennet and prepared for backgammon. Okay, couple of things here. Libraries and novels didn't used to have the standard in society that they do today. It didn't, reading a novel in this day and age was kind of rebellious. It's kind of sketchy, you're reading a novel. Oh, that's kind of, reading a novel, especially in a circulating library, a novel was kind of like, you're reading a novel. That's, it was something people did, but it was kind of seen as, risky or, enticing rebellious behavior. They were like, oh. So, yeah. It was, the books of this time were more solemnity. So, this is, the era in which Jane Austen is writing is the era in which the modern novel kind of gained more, the modern novel kind of came to be. So the Pride and Prejudice and books that Jane Austen wrote and books that other authors of this time wrote are the start of what we would consider modern literature and reading novels. Before this time it was very serious and historical or plays or events that happened or something very biblical type shit. But this is the start of more, if you think of it in terms of anime, slice of life anime novel. I actually have a manga. I have a manga of Pride and Prejudice. I think I put it upstairs. I took it upstairs for something. Yeah, it's upstairs. But I have a manga of Pride and Prejudice. I'll get it out next time we read on next Tuesday. But I have a manga of Pride and Prejudice that I have that's really good. If anybody, I'll take it out next Tuesday, or I'll post a picture of it on Discord. But yeah, it's a very good manga of Pride and Prejudice if anyone's interested in that. If that's more interesting than, actually reading it. But yeah. So, yeah, this is the start of the modern novel. So Mr. Collins being like, I could never read a novel. That's not classy gentleman behavior. And he's reading, again, a sermon, which is boring. And it's also kind of highlighting, there's a little bit of dysfunction here that they're trying to work through. So Mr. Collins is in a place of power, and the Bennets are in a place of power, and it's kind of a risky place of power. So there's a little bit of a power play going on here where Mr. Collins will take over the estate, and that's very scary to the Bennets, but Mr. Collins knows that it's going to be easier for him to get the estate. It's going to be a lot less hassle if he's on good terms with the Bennets. So he's trying to be on good terms with the Bennets, and the Bennets are trying to be on good terms with him, but they don't really know each other, so there's just this weird mesh of no, I'm sorry, no, you're sorry, no, I'm sorry, no, you're sorry. And it's kind of like in a dysfunctional family when you're trying to keep the peace. You're so focused on not starting conflict, and you're so afraid of conflict that you're just oh my god, I'm so sorry, because you're trying to not start a conflict situation. And that's kind of what's happening here. Lydia does something very dumb where she's okay, well, our guest is reading to us. Instead of appreciating our guest, we're gonna talk. And yes, the book is boring. It's a biblical sermon. I'm sure nobody wants to fucking hear that. But Lydia's just being very impulsive here. And remember, Lydia's 15, 16. So, just... Yeah, so you can also see that it's not the parents that are telling Lydia to not interrupt. It's Jane and Lizzie. So Jane and Lizzie are the ones telling Lydia not to interrupt. So Jane and Lizzie are taking the parenting role of being like, Lydia, not okay, not etiquette, you know? Just, yeah. Mr. Collins was not a sensible man, and the deficiency of nature had been but little assisted by education or society. The greater part of his life having been spent under the guidance of an illiterate and miserly father, and though he belonged to one of the universities, he had merely kept up the necessary terms without forming it at any useful acquaintance. The subjection in which his father had brought him up had given him originally great humility of manner, but it was now a good deal counteracted by self-conceit of a weak head, living in retirement and consequential feelings of early and unexpected prosperity. A fortunate chance had recommended him to Lady Catherine de Bourgh when the living of Hunsford was vacant, and the respect which he felt for her high rank and his veneration for her as a patroness mingled with very good opinion of himself, of his authority as a clergyman, and of his right as a rector, made him altogether a mixture of pride, obsequiousness, self-importance, and humility. Having now a good house and a very sufficient income, he intended to marry, and in seeking reconciliation with the Longbourn family, he had a wife in view, as he meant to choose one of the daughters. If he found them as handsome and amiable as they were represented by common report, this was his plan of amends, of atonement, for inheriting their father's estate, and he thought it an excellent one, full of eligibility and suitableness, and excessively generous and disinterested on his part. His plan did not vary on seeing them. Miss Bennet's lovely face confirmed his views, and established all the strictest notions of what was due to seniority, and for the first evening she was his settled choice. The next morning, however, made an alteration, for in a quarter of an hour tea with Mrs. Bennet before breakfast, a conversation beginning with his parsonage house, and leading naturally to the avowal of his high hopes that a mistress might be found at Longbourn, produced from her, amid a very complacent smiles and general encouragement, a caution against the very Jane he had fixed on. As to her younger daughters, she could not take upon herself her to say. She could not positively answer, but she did not know of any prepossession. Her eldest daughter, she must mention, she felt incumbent on her to hint, was very likely to soon be engaged. Mr. Collins only had to change from Jane to Elizabeth, and it was soon done. While Mrs. Bennet was stirring the fire, Elizabeth, equally next to Jane in birth and beauty, succeeded her, of course. Mrs. Bennet treasured up the hint, trusted that she might soon have 2 daughters married, and the man whom she could not bear to speak of the day before was now in her good graces. So Jane is actually based off of Jane Austen's older sister. So Jane Austen had an older sister with whom she was very close, and that is who Jane is based off of. If anything, I would say Charlotte is probably the author's input here. There are things that Charlotte says in this book that is very clearly the author talking through the character. Charlotte is very blunt in pointing out society, and I think that's more the author talking. Again, during this time, like, if you ever study history, and you study British history, everyone is fucking named George or Henry. Every girl is named Jane or Mary. There's no variance. Everybody has, like, the same fucking name. Everyone's named Charles. I don't know. Darcy is named Fitzwilliam, and his cousin is still named Fitzwilliam, too. Like, everybody has the same names. There's, like, 5 names that everyone has. Like, it's evident in the sisters, right? Because you have Jane, you have Elizabeth, you have Mary, you have Kitty, whose real name is Catherine, right? And then you have Lydia. The last sister has the weirdest name because there's 5 of them. Like, what do you do? Like, I have 4 sisters. We don't all have the same parents, but we grew up together, because my dad was a cheater, but, yeah. So, but, like, we grew up together, and even after he died, like, my stepmom and my mother tried to keep us all together and keep the family intact. And we took care of my half-sister and my stepsisters while my stepmom was going through chemo, you know, stuff like that. So, like, we are a family. They are my sisters. Oh, what's your bad joke? Give it to me. Let's go. But, yeah, so we're a family, but, like, was Charles in charge? I mean, there was a King Charles. There was a King Charles somewhere in history. Whether he was in charge depends on who the queen was. And who the cabinet was. And who the ministers was. And who was shielding him from reality. But yeah, like, my youngest sister is named Moira. Why? Because there's fucking 5 of us. Oh. Okay. I might know this show, I might have just missed the reference. Yeah. But, like... Well, also my dad wanted all of us to have, like, very, like, Irish-sounding names. So yeah, my youngest sister is named Moira. We called her Moi Moi. No one can pronounce her name. No one can spell her name. But yeah, Mr. Colins is basically saying, oh, I want to smooth over all the bad relations between the families at Longbourn because I'm going to inherit Longbourn. It would work out perfectly because society demands that I take a wife. I'll just marry one of my cousins at Longbourn, and therefore when I inherit the Longbourn estate, I'll appease her family by having the estate and being married to her, so her family will still have the ability to stay at the estate and basically be at the estate, and I'll appease my patroness in the world and society around me by getting married. I think there are a lot of people who get married because of societal standards. Which I think is dumb, but it happens. Like, that's how my parents got married. They were 21, high, not sober, or mentally stable. They got married because that's what society says. Society said that. And, you know, you see it again, like, people, and, like, now they're divorced. I think that's one part of the reason the divorce rate skyrocketed. Is, like, society says, oh, this is what you're supposed to be, but then so you feel compelled to be that thing, but it's not always... You know, it's another reason why I'm never going to get married unless insurance policies demand it. Like, the only reason I'd get married is if my partner had better insurance than me. I'll make a spreadsheet and be like, these are the 5 reasons we should get married. You have better insurance. And then if insurance demands we need to get divorced, because sometimes that happens when you have medical conditions. You have to get divorced in order to qualify to pay for your medical conditions. We'll get divorced. Like, I think, yeah, but it's a very, like, societal thing, and I think a lot of people get trapped in marriages that they're not happy in because it's a society thing, and this is what Mr. Colins is going through. He's very pressured by society, and he doesn't realize that the pressure is maybe not something, but, so he doesn't really care who's his wife, he just cares that he gets a wife. And so he's like, oh, Jane is very pretty, because everyone thinks Jane's pretty. I'll marry Jane. And Mrs. Bennet's like, no, Jane's gonna get married. He's like, okay, well, now Elizabeth's the light of my life. He just switches like that. He's not in it for love, he's getting married because that's what society demands of someone in his position. So that is what he is doing. And he's also he does seem kind of obsessed with sex at the same time. He does seem kind of obsessed with the female form. It's very possible he's, a 25-year-old virgin. Although, to be fair, most guys at this time who had status and wealth would have hooked up with someone. Like, it was happening. They just never talked about it. But it was implied. Yeah. So Mrs. Bennet is now very happy because, remember, Lizzie's not her favorite. Jane and Lydia are her favorites. But Lizzie is not her favorite. She doesn't really, Lizzie's, wit isn't really something she admires. So she is like, okay, well, this guy's here. He wants a wife. Lizzie's fine. Go marry Lizzie. Lizzie's great. And Mr. Colins is like, okay, I'll do that then. Again, he's kind of like a quote-unquote nice guy. It doesn't really matter what the girl is. He just wants a girl, and he's going to be like, his goal is to get a wife. That's it. So now Mrs. Bennet is ecstatic about Mr. Colins because she sees his plan and she's happy about it because that means more of her daughters can get married, and that is her goal, is to get her daughters well settled and married. So that issues like this don't happen to them. Again, a lot of Mrs. Bennet's antics come from her fear of her daughters being kicked out and destitute because women did not have a voice in this time period. But that fear has taken over her life and has caused her to behave in this very irrational manner. And there's possibly also some, personality traits she just naturally has that just don't really jive well with this fear. And maybe those personality traits were a little more in check when she was younger and didn't have as many daughters or didn't have, any kids. And the personality traits sort of more came out when the fear was more pronounced. I don't know how much sense that makes, but I'm hoping it kind of gets across. Lydia's intention of walking to Meryton was not forgotten. Every sister except Mary agreed to go with her. Mr. Colins was to attend them at the request of Mr. Bennet, who was most anxious to get rid of him and have his library to himself. For thither Mr. Colins had followed him after breakfast, and there he would continue, nominally engaging with one of the largest folios in the collection, but really talking to Mr. Bennet, with little cessation, of his house and garden at Hunsford. Such doings discomposed Mr. Bennet exceedingly. In his library, he had always been sure of leisure and tranquillity, and though prepared, as he told Elizabeth, to meet with folly and conceit in every other room of the house, he was used to be free from them there. His civility, therefore, was most prompt in inviting Mr. Colins to join his daughters on their walk. And Mr. Colins, being in fact much better fitted for a walker than a reader, was extremely well pleased to close his large book and go. So Mr. Bennet's like, hey, get out of my safe space. So if any of you know, it's important in your house to have a safe space, a space that is yours and solely yours to go to if you need to relax. So for me, that's the bathroom. We have 2 bathrooms, one works better than the other, and I take the one that doesn't work that well, and I go and I sit in there when I have flashbacks or a panic attack, because I can lock the door. My room doesn't have a door, and I can't really do anything panicky in there because it'll mess up my sleep schedule, because chronic insomnia means that you need to just associate your room with sleep, so I don't spend time in my room. This is my sister's room I've converted. This is also kind of turned into a bit of a safe space, but it's important to make safe spaces in your house. So Mr. Bennett's house, his safe space is the library. That's where he can be himself and not deal with anything, and Mr. Colins is kind of invading his safe space, and he wants Mr. Colins out. That's kind of what's happening here. So, and this happens a lot when you have guests where they're just like in your hair all the time. And that's sometimes a good thing, and sometimes it can be a little bit grating. Like, even when you have guests, it's important to still have space. So, like, in your apartment, in your house, in whatever dorm room you're in, it's important to make space. I once, because I didn't have a lot of room where I was currently residing, I bought one of those cardboard, like coloring playhouses for kids at Michael's, and I set it up in this room, and I just put blankets in there, and I just sat in there. I brought my computer into this cardboard little tiny playhouse, and I just sat in there, and that was my safe space. So, like, you can make a safe space out of a lot of things. Like, boxes, books, make a fort, you know? Have some fun with it. Make a fort if you don't have a safe space. It's okay to make a blanket fort. Blanket forts are fine. You can do a lot with thumbtacks and a hammer and a blanket. But yeah, safe spaces are an important feature, and Mr. Ben's basically telling Mr. Colins, hey, fuck out of my safe space. Essentially. In pompous nothings on his side and civil assents on that of his cousins, their time passed until they entered Meryton. The attention of the younger ones was no longer to be gained by him. Their eyes were immediately wandering up the street in question of the officers, and nothing less than a very smart bonnet indeed, or a really new muslin in a shop window could recall them. But the attention of every lady was soon caught by a young man, with whom they have never seen before, a most gentlemanlike appearance, walking with an officer on the other side of the way. The officer was the very Mr. Denny, concerning those whose return from London Lydia came to inquire, and he bowed as they passed. All were struck with the stranger's air, all wondered who he could be, and Kitty and Lydia, determined if possible to find out, led the way across the street under the pretense of wanting something in an opposite shop, and fortunately had just gained the pavement when the 2 gentlemen, turning back, had reached the same spot. Mr. Denny addressed them directly, and entreated permission to introduce his friend, Mr. Wickham, who had returned with him the day before from town, and was happy to say had accepted a commission to be in their corps. This was exactly as it should be, for the young man wanted only regimentals to make him completely charming. His appearance was greatly in his favor. He had all the best part of beauty, a fine countenance, a good figure, and very pleasing address. The introduction was followed up on his side by a happy readiness of conversation, a readiness at the same time perfectly correct and unassuming, and the whole party were still standing and talking together very agreeably when the sound of horses drew their notice, and Darcy and Bingley were seen riding down the street. On distinguishing the ladies of the group, the 2 gentlemen came directly towards them, and began usual civilities. Bingley was the principal spokesman, and his object Miss Bennet the principal object. He was then, he said, on his way to Longbourn on the purpose of inquiring after her, and Darcy corroborated it with a bow, and was beginning to determine not to fix his eyes on Elizabeth, when they were suddenly arrested by the sight of the stranger, and Elizabeth, happening to see the countenance as they both looked at each other, was all astonishment at the effect of the meeting. Both changed color, one looked white, the other red. Mr. Wickham, after a few moments, touched his hat, a salutation which Mr. Darcy just deigned to return. What could be the meaning of it? It was impossible to imagine. It was impossible not to long to know. In another minute, Mr. Bingley, without seeming to have noticed what passed, took leave and rode with his friend. So, there's a hot guy in town, is essentially what's happening. Mr. Wickham's the new hot guy in town. All he needed was a soldier's coat, and now he's a completely stunning hot. New hot guy in town, basically, and they want to meet the new hot guy in town. But remember, you can't just walk up to someone and introduce yourself. You have to know somebody else. So they know Miss Denny, who's another officer. So Lydia, taking a page out of her mother's book, is like, there's a hat in that shop. Let's pretend we want it. And she times the crossing so that they come to the shop right as Mr. Denny and Wickham are passing it. She's taken a leaf out of her mother's book here, and it's very interesting to note that. Meaning that Mrs. Bennet maybe passed, because Lydia's one of Mrs. Bennet's favorites, so maybe she passed a little bit more on to Lydia. So they meet Mr. Wickham. Now, it's also kind of revealed that maybe Mr. Wickham and Darcy have a history. There seems to be some recognition. It doesn't seem to be good recognition. And Elizabeth's saying it's impossible to know, but she wants to know. It's like when you notice something that's really interesting about two people, and you're like, oh my god, what's the story there? But you can't be a gossip about it because you don't want to be like rude or improper. So you can't just walk up and be like, oh my god, what's going on? Like, you can't be gossipy about it. You have to like just observe and wait. But you want the information. You want to, like, grasp the information. Mr. Denny and Mr. Wickham walked with the young ladies to the door of Mr. Phillips' house, and then made their bows, in spite of Miss Lydia's pressing entreaties that they would come in, and even in spite of Mrs. Phillips throwing open the parlor window and loudly seconding the invitation. Mrs. Phillips was always glad to see her nieces, and the two eldest from their recent absence were particularly welcome, and she was eagerly expressing her surprise at their sudden return home, which, as her own carriage had not fetched them, she would have known nothing about, if she had not happened to see Mr. Jones' shop boy in the street, who had told her that they were not to send any more draughts to Netherfield because the Bennets were come away. And when her civility was claimed towards Mr. Colins by Jane's introduction of him, she received him with her very best politeness, which he returned with as much more, apologizing for his intrusion without any previous acquaintance with her, which he could not help flattering himself, however, might be justified by his relationship to the young ladies who introduced him to her notice. Mrs. Phillips was quite awed by such an excess of good breeding, but her contemplation of one stranger was soon put to an end by the exclamations and inquiries about the others, of whom, however, she could only tell her nieces what they already knew, that Mr. Denny had brought him from London, and that he was to have a lieutenant's commission in the Shire, in Hertfordshire, basically the Shire Corps. She had been watching him the last hour, she said, as he walked up and down the street, and had Mr. Wickham appeared, Kitty and Lydia would certainly have continued the occupation. But unluckily, no one passed the windows now except a few of the officers, who, in comparison with the stranger, were become stupid and disagreeable fellows. Some of them were to dine with the Phillipses the next day, and their aunt promised to make her husband call on Mr. Wickham, and give him an invitation also, if the family from Longbourn would come in the evening. So, Mrs. Phillips is Mrs. Bennet's sister. And you can kind of see, Mrs. Phillips doesn't have any kids, but you can kind of see what Mrs. Bennet would be like if she didn't have as many daughters, or if she didn't have kids. Because Miss Phillips is a very good example of this. So if you look at Miss Phillips, you can kind of see what Mrs. Bennet would be like without that. So Mrs. Phillips has basically been living in a town by officers, and she basically hosts these parties with the officers and the young ladies. She gets all the gossip. She knows all the news. She knows everyone in town. She's kind of like that one lady who knows everything that's going on in town. And also, like, she's kind of like made herself the center of this like officer community, where she's on very good relations with all of them. But you can also see that she's a little bit like Mrs. Bennet, where she's very like, you know, sporadic and a busybody and kind of sticking her nose sometimes in places she doesn't really need to, but she's around. And you can also see that now there's a new hot guy in town who's like a 10, where the others are maybe like a 5. Nobody's, like, people aren't as interested. But, I mean, there's a lot of officers, and Lydia and Kitty. It's alright. My mind wanders while listening to things too. I post all my streams on YouTube, so if you ever want to go back and, like, re-listen to something, it'll be on YouTube. I post it, like, right after I stream. So if you ever want to go back and, like, re-listen to something I'm saying or anything like that, you can always do that, and it's totally cool. I also talk a lot, too. I also provide a lot of insight, because I have a lot to say. I like to talk, so... But, yeah, like, you do not have to feel bad about having your mind wander. It's totally okay. It'll be on YouTube later if you want to check it out and go at it at your own pace as well. He is a competitor. Mr. Wickham is the new hot guy in town. And everybody wants to know who he is and what his deal is. Yeah, so Mr. Wickham and Mr. Colins are... Mr. Colins is, like... So you can also see that Mr. Colins is very good at flattering people who are a little bit older than him. And maybe a little bit not as astute and insightful into the ways of the world. Alright. And you can also see, again, Mrs. Phillips has been watching Wickham and Denny walk up and down the street. One, because he's the new hot guy, and two, because he's a hot guy. And even though she's an older woman, she's still got to probably acknowledge that he's a hot guy. And it's just like, we're back to the subject of walking. So remember how Darcy was like, hey, Elizabeth, I like your butt when you're walking, and I can admire it better from here. Mrs. Phillips is basically like, oh yeah, I've been watching him walk up and down the street for the past hour. He's really hot. Like, you know, it's basically that. Yeah. This was agreed to, and Mrs. Phillips protested that they would have a nice, comfortable, noisy game of lottery tickets, and a little bit of a hot supper afterwards. The prospect of such delights was very cheering, and they parted in mutual good spirits. Mr. Colins, with unwearying civility, that they were perfectly Mr. Colins repeated his apologies in quitting the room, and assured with unvarying civility that they were perfectly needless. As they walked home, Elizabeth related to Jane what she had seen pass between the two gentlemen, but though Jane would have defended either or both, had they appeared to be wrong, she could no more explain such behavior than her sister. So, like, yeah, you can see that Mrs. Phillips doesn't really have kids, but she likes to host parties for, you know, a bunch of younger people to come and hang out and play games and have food. She's very much like a staple in the community, and she knows everything that's going on in the community, and you can kind of see who she would be if, like, who Miss Bennet would be if she didn't have kids, and that's kind of like Mrs. Phillips. Also, yeah, Wickham and Darcy got beef. No one knows what it is, and, you can't just go asking around that kind of stuff. Yeah. Mr. Colins, on his return, highly gratified by Mrs. Bennet by the admiring Mrs. Phillips' manners and politeness, he protested that, except Lady Catherine, her daughter, he had never seen a more elegant woman, for she had not only received him with the utmost civility, but had even pointedly included him in her invitation for the next evening, although utterly unknown to her before, something he supposed might be attributed to his connection with them, but yet he had never met with so much attention in the whole course of his life. Yeah. Mr. Collins is just trying to smooth his way to the top, you know? He's a smooth talker. He's full of bullshit, but he's a smooth talker. Although I don't think Mr. Collins is malicious. I think Mr. Collins is delusional. Not like in a bad way, but like in a way where Mr. Collins, maybe naive is the right word. He's a little bit like out of touch with the world. Not grounded in reality. So he's like, Mrs. Phillips is so nice and all of this, where the reality is Mrs. Phillips hosts these parties all the time where she's inviting people she doesn't really know to come to her house and have fun and play games. So it's not unheard, like, the reality is she would have probably invited Mr. Collins anyway, having not met him. Because it's like, oh yeah, you're with my nieces, like, come on, come in, like, you know, we're having a party, that type of stuff. Yeah. Etc., etc. So, yeah. As no objection was made to the young people's engagement with their aunt, and all Mr. Collins's scruples of leaving Mr. and Mrs. Bennet for a single evening during his visit were most steadily resisted, the coach conveyed him and his 5 cousins at a suitable hour to Meryton, and the girls had the pleasure of hearing, as they entered the drawing room, that Mr. Wickham had accepted their uncle's invitation, and was then in the house. When this information was given, and they had all taken their seats, Mr. Colins was at leisure to look around him and admire, and he was so much struck with the size of the furniture of the apartment that he declared he might almost have supposed himself in the small summer breakfast parlor at Rosings, a comparison that did not at first convey much gratification, but when Mrs. Phillips understood from him what Rosings was and who was its proprietor, when she had listened to the description of only one of Lady Catherine's drawing rooms, and found that the chimney-piece had cost £800, she felt all the force of the compliment and would hardly have resented the comparison with the housekeeper's room. Oh, I will do a little dance. Oh, I guess I could put dog treats on there. They don't usually hang out down here too much. I will do a little dance. I will do a little dance. Do you like my little dance? I'm doing a little dance. I can't dance, I'm very white, but I'm doing a little dance. Little dance. Little dance. I could put dog treats on there. I mean, they don't really hang out here too much. Maple hangs out here sometimes. She's not hanging out here today. But I could put dog treats on here. I don't know if the dogs would come down, but I could put dog treats on here. The safety dance? I don't know what the safety dance is. Huh. Maybe I should look into that. I'm not a good dancer. I try. I'm not that good. I mean, my sister did like professional ballet for like years, so I don't have a great comparison, but like in describing to her all the grandeur of Lady Catherine and her mansion, with the occasional digressions and praise of his own humble abode, and the improvements it was receiving, he was happily employed until the gentlemen joined them, and he found Mrs. Phillips a very attentive listener, whose opinion of his consequence increased with what she heard, and who was resolving to retail it all among her neighbours as soon as she could. So the girls, who could not listen to their cousin, and who had nothing to do but wish for amusement, and examine their own indifferent imitations of china on the mantelpiece, the interval of waiting appeared very long. It was over at last, however, and the gentlemen did approach, and when Mr. Wickham walked into the room, Elizabeth felt she had neither been seeing him before nor thinking of him since, with the smallest degree of unreasonable admiration. The officers of Hertfordshire were in general a very creditable gentlemanlike set, and the best of them were of the present party, but Mr. Wickham was far beyond all of them in person, countenance, air, and walk, as they were superior to the broad-faced, scruffy Uncle Phillips, breathing port wine, who followed them into the room. Oh, I'm remembering, wait. I remember the song, vaguely. It's in the back of my mind. Like, we can dance if you want to. Yeah, it's like in the back of my mind. Yeah, so everybody is completely stricken by Mr. Wickham. Wickham stricken. Wickham has stricken them. So yeah. And also, yeah, Mr. Colins talking about improvements to his house is probably not a very interesting conversation to listen to. Wick-stricken, yep. Mr. Wickham was the happy man towards almost every female eye was turned, and Elizabeth was the happy woman by whom he finally seated himself, and the agreeable manner in which he immediately fell into conversation, though it was only on it being a wet night, and on the probability of a rainy season, made her feel that the commonest, dullest, most threadbare topic might be rendered interesting by the skill of the speaker. With such rivals for the notice of the of the affair as Mr. Wickham and the officers, Mr. Collins seemed to sink into insignificance. To the young ladies he certainly was nothing, but he still had intervals of a kind listener in Mrs. Phillips, and was, by her watchfulness, most abundantly supplied with coffee and muffin. When the card tables were placed, he had an opportunity of obliging her return by sitting down to whist. "I know little of the game at present," said he, "but I shall be glad to improve myself for my situation in life." Mrs. Phillips was very thankful for his compliance, but could not wait for his reason. Mr. Wickham did not play at whist, and with ready delight he was received at the other table between Elizabeth and Lydia. At first there seemed danger of Lydia engrossing him entirely, for she was a most determined talker. But being likewise extremely fond of lottery tickets, she soon grew too much interested in the game, too eager in making bets, and exclaiming after prizes, to have attention for anyone in particular, allowing for the common demands of the game. Mr. Wickham was therefore at leisure to talk with Elizabeth, and she was very willing to hear him, though what she chiefly wished to hear she could not hope to be told. The history of his acquaintance with Mr. Darcy, she dared not even mention that gentleman. Her curiosity, however, was unexpectedly relieved. Mr. Wickham began the subject himself. He inquired how far Netherfield was from Meryton, and after receiving her answer, asked in a hesitating manner how long Mr. Darcy had been staying there. "About a month," said Elizabeth, then, unwilling to let the subject drop, added, "He is a man of very large property in Derbyshire, I understand." "Yes," replied Wickham, "his estate there is a noble one, a clear £10,000 per annum. You could not have met with a person more capable of giving you certain information on that head than myself, for I have been connected with his family in a particular manner from my infancy." Elizabeth could not but look surprised. "You may very well be surprised, Miss Bennet, at such an assertion, but after seeing, as you probably might, the very cold manner of our meeting yesterday. Are you much acquainted with Mr. Darcy?" "As much as I ever wished to be," cried Elizabeth warmly. "I have spent 4 days in the same house with him, and I think him very disagreeable." "I have no right to give you my opinion," said Wickham, "as to his being agreeable or otherwise. I am not qualified to form one. I have known him too long, too well, to be a fair judge. It is impossible for me to be impartial. But I believe your opinion of him would in general astonish, and perhaps you would not express it quite strongly anywhere else. Here you are with your family." "Upon my word, I say no more here than I might say in any house in the neighborhood, except Netherfield. He is not at all liked in Hertfordshire. Everyone is disgusted with his pride. You will not find him more favorably spoken by anyone." "I cannot pretend to be sorry," said Wickham, after a short interruption, "that he or any man should not be estimated beyond their deserts, but with him I believe it does happen often. The world is blinded by his fortune and consequence, or frightened by his high imposing manners, and sees him only as he chooses to be seen. I should take him by even my slightest acquaintance to be an ill-tempered man." Wickham only shook his head. "I wonder," said he, at the next opportunity of speaking, "whether he is likely to be in the country much longer." "I do not at all know, but I heard nothing of his going away when I was at Netherfield. I hope your plans in favor of the Hertfordshire will not be affected by his being in the neighborhood." "Oh, no, it is not for me to be driven away by Darcy. If he wishes to avoid seeing me, he must go. We are not on friendly terms, and it always gives me pain to meet him. But I have no reason for avoiding him, but what I might proclaim before all the world, a sense of very great ill-usage, and most painful regrets at his being what he is. His father, Miss Bennet, the late Mr. Darcy, was one of the best men that ever breathed, and the truest friend I ever had. And I can never be in company with this Mr. Darcy without being grieved to his soul by 1,000 tender recollections. His behavior to myself has been scandalous, but I verily believe I could forgive him anything and everything, rather than his disappointing the hopes and disgracing the memory of his father." So, here's the thing. As I said before, in this time period, you did not discuss personal matters when first meeting someone. He's just met Elizabeth. Just met her, like 5 minutes ago, and he's already like, "Oh yeah, Darcy and I don't get along. I used to know his entire family. Is he liked here? What's the deal here?" He's already like sharing his life story. And like nowadays, yeah, there are people like that all the time. I'm one of them. I don't have a filter. It's a problem. PTSD makes it very, very difficult to like, I think it's not just PTSD. I think a lot of people who have been through a lot of like pain and hardship in life find it difficult to have casual conversations. 3 suitors. I know, Elizabeth's getting dick. I don't know. She's making the rounds. Not making the rounds, but you know, she's definitely got something. She's definitely got that it factor. You know what I mean? They're all competing for Elizabeth, not Jane. So Bingley's the only one currently interested in Jane. But yeah, Wickham, Darcy, and Mr. Collins are all competing for Elizabeth. They don't know they're all competing for Elizabeth, but they are all competing for Elizabeth. So Elizabeth, Wickham basically pouring his heart out to Elizabeth here, it's kind of strange, and Elizabeth doesn't pick up on it, which is also strange. Because Elizabeth, I think, is very, like, go against the grain type, and here's the thing, it's, as a punk rock and emo enthusiast, who has disabilities and doesn't fit in society even if I tried, going against society is cool. Going against society standards is fun, and it can be very progressive, and it can be good, but sometimes it does blind you to things that you should have, that are a red flag that you should have seen. And this is a red flag, but because Elizabeth kind of goes against society a little bit, she doesn't really notice it because she's just like, oh, we're talking, we're having a conversation. It's okay if you tell me things. Like, let's break that rule, you know? Let's be adventurous. Let's be playful. Let's talk about things. I want to know about things. Like, she's very, like, she needs to know about a lot of things, which I relate to. But, like, it causes her not to see this red flag of Wickham just meeting her 5 minutes ago and pouring out his life story. And in some cases, that can be a red flag even in today's times. You meet someone and in 5 minutes they're suddenly pouring out this life story and talking about things and doing all that. Like, that's a lot. You know? Like, again, I do it because I can't do casual talk very well. But a lot of people find it to be very, unsettling. Which I'm trying to work on because I don't want to make people feel unsettled. Social pressure, oh no. But, like, because Elizabeth, sometimes when you do that, like, go against society thing, it can be very good. It's generally good a lot of the time. But you can miss red flags that are there for a reason. If you know what I mean. And this is a red flag that is there kind of for a reason. And Elizabeth is missing it. But she really wants to know the story, and I think Wickham... That would be epic as hell. Unfortunately, I don't think it's gonna go that way. But, like, yeah. But she does really want to know the story, and Wickham has noticed that Elizabeth noticed the thing between Darcy and him. That's probably why he's sitting next to her, because he noticed that she noticed the looks between him and Darcy, and that she's an observant person. So he's trying to, like, clear it up, and eventually get the view of Hertfordshire on Darcy. Essentially. And you can see the way he's kind of talking in circles here, where he's like, oh, I don't like Darcy, but I can never say anything bad about him because I love Darcy's father, you know, or like, Darcy treated me ill, but I can never say anything bad about him. He's saying bad things about Darcy, but he's covering it up by saying, like, I can never say anything bad because I like his father. So it's a very manipulative way of speaking, where he's basically being like, Darcy's a bad guy, but I could never say anything bad. That type of shit. Like, you know, like, oh, he treated me badly, but I loved his father, so I could never think ill of him. You know, he's trying to make himself sound better than the situation, and sound more moral than the situation. He's telling the story where he's above the situation, and Darcy's below him. You know, he's more mature than the situation at hand. Sometimes that is genuine, you know? Sometimes it's genuine to be more mature than the situation at hand. But I think with Wickham, if you pay attention to the way he speaks, it doesn't always seem genuine. And I think the writing is very good with Wickham here, because it seems genuine until you really break down the wording. And then you're like, what is going on here? But Elizabeth really wants the story, and to be fair, we the audience also really want the story. So we're going to bypass it because knowledge is power, and we want that power. Elizabeth found the interest of the subject increase and listened with all her heart, but the delicacy of it prevented further inquiry. Mr. Wickham began to speak on more general topics, Meryton, the neighborhood, the society, appearing highly pleased with all that he had seen, and speaking of the latter especially with gentle but intelligible gallantry. It was the prospect of constant society and good society, he added, which was my chief inducement to the centre of Hertfordshire. I knew it to be a most respectable, agreeable corps, and my friend Denny tempted me farther by his account of their present quarters, and of the very attentions and excellent acquaintance of that Meryton had produced them. Society, I own, is necessary to me. I have been a disappointed man, and my spirits will not bear solitude. I must have employment and society. A military life is not what I was intended for, but circumstances have now made it eligible. The church ought to have been my profession. I was brought up for the church, and I should at this time have been in possession of most valuable living, had it pleased the gentleman of which we were speaking just now. Indeed! Yes, the late Mr. Darcy bequeathed me the next presentation of the best living in his gift. He was my godfather, and excessively attached to me. I cannot do justice to his kindness. He meant to provide for me amply, and thought he had done it, but when the living fell, it was given elsewhere. Good heavens, cried Elizabeth, but how can that be? How could this will be disgraced? Why did he not seek legal redress? There was just such an informality in the terms of the bequest as to give it me no hope of law. A man of honor would not have doubted the intention, but Mr. Darcy chose to doubt it, or to treat it as merely a conditional recommendation. To assert that I had forfeited all claim by extravagance and prudence in short of anything or nothing. Certain it is that the living became vacant 2 years ago, exactly as I was of age to hold it, and that it was given to another man, and no less certain is it that I cannot accuse myself of having really done anything to deserve to lose it. I have a warm, unguarded temper, and I may perhaps sometimes have spoken of my opinion of him, and to him, too freely. I can recall nothing worse, but the fact is that we are very different sort of men, and that he hates me. This is quite shocking. He deserves to be publicly disgraced. Sometime or other he will be, but it may not be by me. Till I can forget his father, I can never defy or expose him. Elizabeth honored him for such feelings, and thought him handsomer than ever when he expressed them. But what, she said after a pause, can be his motive? What can he have induced him to behave so cruelly? A thoroughly determined dislike of me, a dislike which I cannot but attribute to some measure of jealousy. Had the late Mr. Darcy liked me less, his son might have borne with me better, but his father's uncommon attachment to me irritated him. I believe, early in life, he had not a temper to bear the sort of competition in which we stood, the sort of preference which was often given to me. I had not thought Mr. Darcy so bad as this. Though I have never liked him, I had not thought so very ill of him. I supposed him to be despising his fellow creatures in general, but I did not suspect him of descending to such malicious revenge, such injustice, such inhumanity as this. After a few minutes' reflection, however, she continued, I do remember his boasting one day at Netherfield of the implacability of his resentments, of his having an unforgiving temper. His disposition must be dreadful. I will not trust myself on the subject, replied Wickham. I can hardly be just to him. Elizabeth was again deep in thought, and after a time explained, to treat in such a manner the godson, the friend of the favorite of his father. She could have added, a young man too like you, whose very countenance may vouch for your being amiable. But she contented herself with, and one too, who was probably seen as his own companion from childhood, connected together, as I think you said, in the closest manner. We were born in the same parish, within the same park. The greatest part of our youth was passed together, inmates of the same house, sharing the same amusements, objects of the same parental care. My father began life in the profession which your uncle, Mr. Phillips, appears to do so much credit to, but he gave up everything to be of use to the late Mr. Darcy, and devoted all his time to the care of Pemberley property. He was most highly esteemed by Mr. Darcy, a most intimate, confidential friend. Mr. Darcy often acknowledged himself to be under the greatest obligation to my father's active superintendence. And when, immediately before my father's death, Mr. Darcy gave him a voluntary promise of providing for me, I am convinced that he felt it to be much of a debt of gratitude to him, as of an affection to myself. How strange, cried Elizabeth, how abominable! I wonder that the pride of Mr. Darcy has not made him just to you, if form no better motive that he should not have been too proud to call dishonest, for dishonesty I must call it. It is wonderful, replied Wickham, for almost all his actions may be traced to pride, and pride has often been his best friend. It has connected him nearer with the virtue than any other feeling, but we are none of us consistent, and his behavior to me, there were stronger impulses even than pride. Can such abdominal pride as this have ever done him good? Yes, it has often led him to be liberal and generous, to give freely, to display hospitality, to assist his tenants and relieve the poor. Family pride, filial pride, for which he is very proud of what his father was, have done this. Not to appear to disgrace his family, to degenerate from popular qualities, or lose the influence of Pemberley House is a powerful motive. He also has brotherly pride, which with some brotherly affection makes him kind and careful guardian of his sister, and you will hear him generally cried up as the most attentive and best of brothers. Alright, have a good day. Hope everything goes well. Eat cake, stay safe, because the more you weigh, the harder you are to kidnap. Yeah, so you can see here that, basically what Wickham is saying is Mr. Darcy's father hired his father, Mr. Wickham's father, to work for him. And Mr. Wickham and Mr. Darcy grew up together. Now, Mr. Darcy's father, when Wickham's father died, told Wickham's father as he was dying that he would provide for Wickham, and arranged for Wickham to basically have a plot of land to live on and go to school to become a preacher. Go to school to become a priest and basically have a living and make an income from that. And Wickham is saying that when Darcy's father died and Darcy took possession, he did not give Wickham the plot of land and the education that he was promised. So Wickham joined the army as a result. That is basically what Wickham is saying. And Elizabeth is saying that's scandalous because Wickham and Darcy were very close friends. They grew up together. They're around the same age. And Wickham was saying, yeah, we were best friends. And yeah, it is. But Darcy was jealous because Darcy's father liked Wickham more. That is essentially what Wickham's saying. That Darcy is prideful and jealous, but also that his pride has served him well because it allows him to be a really good brother. And he is a very, very, very good brother to his sister Georgiana and takes very good care of her. Essentially. That's kind of the bulk of this. So that's kind of scummy on Darcy's part, right? So yeah, that's kind of what Wickham's saying. And again, it's very strange that Wickham is saying all of this within like 5 to 10 minutes of meeting Elizabeth. It's very strange, but because Elizabeth really wants the story, and she already doesn't like Darcy, and she's very interested in this very hot man who is, let's be real, explaining something that is very, very hot and attractive. Like, he's explaining it, and he's very hot and attractive, and he probably knows how to use that to his advantage, because, let's be real, most people who are hot and attractive have used that at some point to their advantage, in quotes, to my boobicles, kind of showing here. So, you know, pointing to. But, like, essentially, yes. That is the case. What sort of girl is Miss Darcy? He shook his head. I wish I could call her amiable. It gives me pain to speak ill of a Darcy, but she is too much like her brother, very, very proud. As a child, she was affectionate and pleasing, and extremely fond of me. I have devoted hours and hours to her amusement, but she is nothing to me now. She is a handsome girl, about 15 or 16, and I understand, and highly accomplished. Since her father's death, her home has been London, where a lady lives with her, and superintends her education. After many pauses and many trials of other subjects, Elizabeth could not help but reverting to the first, and saying, I am astonished at his intimacy with Mr. Bingley. How can Mr. Bingley, who seems good humor itself, is, I really believe, truly amiable, be in a friendship with such a man? How can they suit each other? Do you know Mr. Bingley? Not at all. He is a sweet-tempered, amiable, charming man. He cannot know what Mr. Darcy is. Probably not, but Mr. Darcy can please where he chooses. He does not want abilities. He can be conversable companion if he thinks it worth his while. Among those who are at all his equals in consequence, he is very different man from what he is to the less prosperous. His pride never deserts him, but with the rich he is liberal-minded, just sincere, rational, honorable, and perhaps agreeable, allowing something for fortune and figure. The whist party soon afterwards breaking up, the players gathered round the other table, and Mr. Colins took his station between his cousin Elizabeth and Mrs. Phillips. The usual inquiries as to his success were made by the latter. It had not been very great. He had lost every point, but when Mrs. Phillips began to express her concern thereupon, he assured her with much earnest gravity that it was not of the least importance, that he considered the money as mere trifle, and begged that she would not make herself uneasy. I know very well, madam, said he, that when persons sit down to a card table, they must take their chance of these things, and happily I am not in such circumstances as to make 5 shillings any object. There's undoubtedly many who could not say the same, but thanks to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, I am removed far beyond the necessary regard of little matters. Mr. Wickham's attention was caught, and after observing Mr. Colins for a few moments, he asked Elizabeth in a low voice whether her relations were very intimately acquainted with the family de Bourgh. Lady Catherine de Bourgh, she replied, has lately given him a living. I hardly know how Mr. Colins was first introduced to her notice, but he certainly has not known her long. You know, of course, that Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Lady Anne Darcy were sisters. Subsequently, she is the aunt to the present Mr. Darcy. No, indeed, I did not. I knew nothing at all of Lady Catherine's connections. I had never heard of her existence till the day before yesterday. Her daughter, Miss de Bourgh, will have a very large fortune, and it's believed that she and her cousin will unite the two estates. This information made Elizabeth smile, as she thought of poor Miss Bingley. Vain indeed must be all her attentions, vain and useless her affection for his sister and her praise of himself, if he were already self-destined to another. Mr. Colins, said she, speaks highly of both Lady Catherine and her daughter, but from some particulars that he has related of her ladyship, I suspect his gratitude misleads him, and in spite of her being his patroness, she is an arrogant, conceited woman. I believe her to be both in great degree, replied Wickham. I have not seen her for many years, but I very well remember that I never liked her. And that her manners were dictatorial and insolent. She has the reputation of being remarkably sensible and clever, but I rather believe she derives part of her abilities from rank and fortune, part from her authoritative manner, and the rest from the pride of her nephew, who chooses that everyone connected with him should have an understanding of the first class. Elizabeth allowed that he had given a very rational account of it, and they continued talking together with mutual satisfaction until supper put an end to cards, and gave the rest of the ladies their share of Mr. Wickham's attentions. There could be no conversation in the noise of Mrs. Phillips's supper party, but his manners were recommended to him to everyone. Whatever he said, was said well. Whatever he did, done gracefully. Elizabeth went away with her head full of him. She could think of nothing but Mr. Wickham and of what he had told her, all the way home, but there was not time for her to even mention his name as they went. For neither Lydia nor Mr. Colins were once silent. Lydia talked incessantly of lottery tickets, of the fish she had lost, and of the fish she had won, and Mr. Colins in describing the civility of Mr. and Mrs. Phillips, protesting that he did not in the least regard his losses at whist, enumerating all the dishes at supper, and repeatedly fearing that he crowded his cousins, had more to say than all he could manage before the carriage stopped at Longbourn House. So, Wickham basically revealed that Lady Catherine, who is the patroness of Mr. Colins, is Darcy's aunt. So the circles are intertwining very slowly. They're intertwining, very much intertwining, as you can see. And in this intertwiningness, you can kind of see everything slowly coming together. Alright. Elizabeth related to Jane the next day what passed between Mr. Wickham and herself. Jane listened with astonishment and concern. She knew not how to believe that Mr. Darcy could be so unworthy of Mr. Bingley's regard, and yet it was not in her nature to question the veracity of a young man of such amiable appearance as Wickham. The possibility of his having really endured such unkindness was enough to interest all her tender feelings, and nothing therefore to remain to be done, but to think well of them both, to defend the conduct of each, and to throw into the account of an accident or mistake whatever could not be otherwise explained. They have both, said she, been deceived, I dare say, in some way or another, of which we can form no idea. Interested people have perhaps misrepresented each to the other. It is, in short, impossible for us to conjecture the cause or circumstances which may have alienated them, without actual blame on either side. Very true, indeed. And now, my dear Jane, what have you got to say on behalf of the interested people who have probably been concerned in the business? Do you clear them, too? Or shall we be obliged to think ill of somebody? Laugh as much as you choose, but you will not laugh me out of my opinion, my dearest Lizzie. Do consider in what disgraceful light it places Mr. Darcy, to be treating his father's favourite in such a manner. One whom his father had promised to provide for. It is impossible. No man of common humanity, no man who had any value for his character, could be capable of it. Can this most intimate friends be so excessively deceived in him? Oh, no. I can much more easily believe Mr. Bingley's being imposed on than that Wickham should invent such a history of himself as he gave me last night. Names, fact, everything he mentioned without ceremony. If it be not so, let Mr. Darcy contradict it. Besides, there was truth in his looks. It is difficult indeed. It is distressing. One does not know what to think. I beg your pardon. One knows exactly what to think. But Jane could not think with certainty on only one point, that Mr. Bingley, if he had been imposed on, would have much to suffer when the affair became public. The two young ladies were summoned from the shrubbery, where this conversation passed, by the arrival of some of the very persons of whom they had been speaking. Mr. Bingley and his sisters came to give their personal invitation for the long-expected ball at Netherfield, which was fixed for the following Tuesdays. The two ladies were delighted to see their dear friend again, called it an age since they had met, and repeatedly asked what she had been doing with herself since their separation. To the rest of the family they paid little attention, avoiding Mrs. Bennet as much as possible, and not saying much to Elizabeth, and nothing at all to the others, when they were soon gone again, rising from their seats with an activity which took their brother by surprise, and hurrying off as if eager to escape from Mrs. Bennet's civilities. The prospect of Netherfield Ball was extremely agreeable to every female in the family. Mrs. Bennet chose to consider it as a given compliment to her eldest daughter, and was particularly flattered by receiving the invitation from Mr. Bingley himself, instead of a ceremonious card. Jane pictured herself to a happy evening in the society of her two friends, with the attentions of their brother, and Elizabeth thought with pleasure of dancing a great deal with Mr. Wickham, and of seeing a confirmation of everything Mr. Darcy's look and behaviour. The happiness anticipated by Catherine and Lydia depended less on any single event or any particular person, for though they, each like Elizabeth, meant to dance half the evening with Mr. Wickham, he was by no means the only partner who could satisfy them, and a ball was at any rate a ball, and even Mary could assure her family that she had no disinclination for it. "Well, I can have my mornings to myself," said she. "It is enough, I think, to sacrifice. It is no sacrifice to join occasionally in the evening engagements. Society has claims on us all, and I profess myself one of those who consider the intervals of recreation and amusement as desirable for everybody." Elizabeth's spirits were so high on the occasion, that though she did not often speak unnecessarily to Mr. Collins, she could not help but asking him whether he intended to accept Mr. Bingley's invitation, and if he did, whether he would think it proper to join the evening's amusement. And she was rather surprised to find that he entertained no scruple whatsoever on that head, and was very far from dreading a rebuke either from the Archbishop or Lady Catherine de Bourgh by venturing a dance. "I am by no means of opinion, I assure you," said he, "that a ball of this kind, given by a young man of character to respectable people, can have any evil tendency. I am so far from objecting to dancing myself that I shall hope to be honoured with the hands of all my fair cousins in the course of the evening, and I take this opportunity of soliciting yours, Miss Elizabeth, for the first two dances, especially, a preference which I trust my cousin Jane will attribute to the right cause, and not to any disrespect to her." Elizabeth felt herself completely taken in. She had fully proposed being engaged by Mr. Wickham for those very dances, and to have Mr. Collins instead. Her liveliness had never been worse timed. There was no help for it, however. Mr. Wickham's happiness and her own perforce was delayed a little longer, and Mr. Collins' proposal accepted with a good grace as she could. She was not the better pleased with his gallantry from the idea that it suggested something more. It now first struck her that she was selected from among her sisters as worthy of being mistress of Hunsford Parsonage, and of assisting to form a quadrille table at Rosings, in the absence of more eligible visitors. The idea soon reached to conviction, as she observed his increasing civilities towards herself, and heard his frequent attempt at compliment on her wit and vivacity. And though more astonished than gratified herself by this effect on her charms, it was not long before her mother gave her to understand that the probability of their marriage was exceedingly agreeable to her. Elizabeth, however, did not choose to take the hint, being well aware that a serious dispute must be the consequence of any reply. Mr. Collins might never make the offer, and till he did, it was useful to quarrel about him. So, the first two dances kind of set the tone for the rest of your dances. The first two dances are like your priority dances. Who are you dancing with first? You know, it's kind of like when you have a lot of energy, who are you going to dance with first? Who's your first choice, so to speak? So Mr. Collins being like, "Oh, Elizabeth, you're my first choice," and Elizabeth being like, "Oh my God, that looks bad for me. I'm going to dance with this bozo." Like, "Oh no, that's not good." Like, fuck. But and then Elizabeth's realizing, "Oh no, he's paying more attention to me." And then and as she realizes he's paying more attention to me, she's like, "Oh no, he may propose to me." And then she's like, if he means to propose to me, that means he thinks I'm qualified to handle, high nobility, which in itself is a little bit of flattery. He's basically saying, hey, he's basically, in kind of making his intentions known that he may propose to her or make her his wife, he is kind of saying, I think you are qualified to lead the life I live, and to deal with some of the most noble people, like some of the most powerful people in, the area right now, which is Lady Catherine de Bourgh. But Elizabeth's also saying, this is not going to work out. I could not marry this guy. This guy is laughable and incompetent. The other thing that Elizabeth is kind of gauging here, she's like, "Oh, are you going to the dance, Mr. Collins?" She's kind of like, "Please don't come to the dance. Please don't come to the dance." And the reason she's saying that is, priests at this time, some of them refrained from dancing. They believed that dancing was not godly or not wholesome. As Darcy said in an earlier chapter, in an earlier stream, any savage can dance. So it wasn't like, so Elizabeth's like, please don't come to the dance. Please say you're not going to come to the dance. Please don't do that. Please don't do that. And Mr. Collins is coming to the dance. And then he's like, oh, hey, I want you for the first dance. Elizabeth's like, no, you're not my first choice, but I don't have a say. Yeah. And then when her mother, Mrs. Bennet, is like, hey, you should be with Mr. Collins more, or like kind of like, you know, keep shoving Elizabeth towards Mr. Collins, Elizabeth is kind of realizing that her mother may have given the go-ahead here. And Elizabeth doesn't give any reply or say anything because she knows that she's going to disagree with her mother and it's going to be a conflict, and she doesn't want conflict. And she's also saying, you know, Mr. Collins hasn't, she's being really smart here and saying, Mr. Collins hasn't made an offer yet, and until he makes an offer, there's no reason to get in an argument about the hypothetical, because she doesn't know if it's going to happen. So, and this is really important, because I think a lot of people, myself included, you know something's coming. Sometimes you know something's coming, there's going to be a conflict between either you and your family, you or a friend, you and a partner, all of that stuff, but it hasn't happened yet. And sometimes we jump the gun. You know, we immediately started on this conflict that hasn't happened yet. And sometimes the other person, no idea of that. Like, or they didn't have any idea of that, or they didn't have any intention of that, or didn't realize that, and then they get really defensive and it causes a problem. And sometimes they do have an idea of it, and it also causes a problem because they have a differing opinion. And I think Elizabeth's being very smart and waiting here because she's like, well, he hasn't said anything yet. And because I don't want to risk the hypothetical, I'm just going to leave it be and wait. That's basically what she's saying. And it's a very smart thing to do. And I think it's a very good thing to apply in life, is just wait and see. If there had not been a Netherfield ball to prepare for and talk of, the younger Miss Bennets would have been in a pitiable state at this time. For the day of the invitation to the ball, there was such a succession of rain as prevented their walking to Meryton once. No aunt, no officers, no news could be sought after, and the very shoe roses for Netherfield were got by proxy. Even Elizabeth might have found some trial of her patience in weather which totally suspended the improvement of her acquaintance with Mr. Wickham, and nothing less than a dance on Tuesday could have made such a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday very endurable to Kitty and Lydia. So, I don't know if any of you have been stuck in the rain. My grandparents used to live in upstate New York in the middle of fucking nowhere. Like, the driveway was a mile long uphill, the nearest town was an hour away, and town is a very generous word. They lived in the middle of nowhere. Also, their house, like, really didn't work. It was, like, one of those houses that's, like, where clearly there was one room, and someone just added a room, and then added a window, and, like, it's very clearly, like, a house that was, like, added together, like, drawers ran into, it was, yeah, drawers ran into each other, it was a lot. But if you've ever been stuck inside, in the rain, for a while, it can suck. One, it's gray, which is not great for sensory processing. I have seasonal affective disorder, so when it gets really gray and there's not a lot of sun, I get very depressed very easily. Like, it's just general human nature. Like, we need sun. Like, we're kind of like plants in the fact that we need sun. Like, so, like, being stuck inside in the rain with nothing to do for hours and days is infuriating, and I understand that. So, like, yeah, having the ball to look forward to is probably very good for them. Yeah, I'm actually gonna end the read-along here. We, next Tuesday, are gonna go to the ball, probably, or get ready for the ball. That will be the stream. So, channel updates. I, may be going back to work. I don't know. I was doing school. I, have a lot of trauma with school, so it's been very hard for me to do school, and I'm also feeling kind of lost and aimless. It's kind of like, I don't know if any of you play Final Fantasy. Some of you probably do. But there's a mount called a Fat Chocobo, and you have a little stick that can hold a cabbage or a piece of cake, and if you want the Fat Chocobo to fly, you need to use the piece of cake. And no matter how hard the Fat Chocobo flies and flaps his tiny little wings, it can never reach the cake. And that's how frustration feels with school. I see the end goal. I see what I want to be, but I can never reach it, no matter how hard I try. and it's frustrating, and it's depressing, and I'm wondering if I should go back to the Department of Rehabilitation and just get job training to be like a secretary or work at some sort of office-y type job. And I'll still stream. It'll probably just change the timing I'm streaming. I'll still be streaming, but I'll just probably be changing the timing. I might go back to streaming some Guild Wars 2 as well, because I made a really pretty character that I'm kind of happy about. But, it's like, yeah, like, the timing, like, yeah. And, it's not going to happen anytime soon, because, one, going through the Department of Rehabilitation is a bureaucratic nightmare. And then I also might have to go back to integrated community services. And, you know, finding a job is hard, and especially finding a job when you're a disabled person that can accommodate, because I can't work a lot of hours. That's my problem. Because I have such, fatigue from 23 years of chronic insomnia, I can't do a lot of work for a long time. So I can't do that part-time bullshit where they schedule you for a full-time job but just leave off an hour. I can't do that. So I need to make sure that I'm doing a job that's part-time and definitely part-time and not that bullshit. Yeah, so like that's my problem. Like I have a bunch of side hustles, and I'm gonna keep doing those side hustles. I'm gonna keep streaming. I'm gonna try to get the OnlyFans up and running. Again, I don't live alone, so it's very hard to take sexy pictures because I don't want my mom walking in on me. That would be very uncomfortable. Or I don't want my dogs walking in on me because, no. But, my dogs just, like, the moment they see me doing something and they walk in a room, they're like, oh, I need to go up to you and say hi, and then yeah. So, then, my attention is caught, by other things. But, like, yeah. So, I'm gonna keep doing my side hustles. I'm gonna work on that. I don't really know if I want to be a history major. I like history. It's my thing. But I don't like school. And a lot of the jobs that history majors do involve school-type environments. And that's very hard for me to be in because of past trauma. Because I've just been part of way too many schools that got shut down by the state for being dangerous to be in. So, yeah. It's been kind of rough. I'll still be streaming again. It's not gonna happen anytime soon. And I'm visiting my girlfriend in September. So anything that'll happen that's like work related or like job training related that might impact the timing of when I stream or when I put out content, is gonna happen after that. So it's kind of like a very like far in the past type deal shit. But it is something that I'm trying to like bring up now to like keep in mind and keep proper communication open. So yeah. That's kind of the updates for the channel. I'm gonna keep rocking, and I hope you will all keep rocking with me and we can have some fun. I'm on YouTube, Discord, Instagram. My Final Fantasy character has a thing on the Eorzean collection. Let me think. I'm trying to think of other things. Oh yeah, Etsy shop is up. You want knitting, knitted gloves. I'm wearing knitted gloves right now, but we have lots more knitting I need to go through. I have a whole laundry basket of knitting behind me, you can kind of see, and I have another laundry basket behind that laundry basket. There's so much knitting. Oh my god. But, yes, I realize it's summer. We'll have a sale during winter, so everyone can get knitted items for winter, because I know it gets cold. Yeah, that's it. Alright, everyone have an amazing day. Stay safe. Eat cake, because the more you weigh, the harder you are to kidnap, and I want you to stick around. I hope your day is fabulous because you are fabulous and your day should reflect that fabulousness. And if it is not fabulous, call me and I will punch the bitch that made it not fabulous. Alright. Goodbye, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.